Hark and well met, folks, and welcome back to another archaeology brunch stream. My name is RuneMeisterKris, and I hope that you're all having a wonderful Sunday morning. I am having today for brunch hole in the bread egg sandwich. So I cut a little ring in my bread, and I cooked the egg in that part of the sandwich, so that now the egg is like in the middle of my sandwich. I think it's on brand, because what we are doing today is we are going to be discussing a very specific element of Viking Age architecture known as Trelleborg ring forts, which are an exciting and cool kind of phenomenon that happened in a little pocket of time within the Viking Age, which is among my favorite times of that period. We're going to go through some articles. We're going to learn a little bit about these. But the very basic idea is that they were a very specific type of fort. It was built, it's just a big ring with four entrances at the four corners, with these kind of two crossroads in the middle and a whole bunch of longhouses. But it was this time period was roughly around 980, like 970 to 980 was when these forts were being built. And like I said, we're going to take a quick look at them in a second, but they're pretty cool. They're pretty unique, and they kind of changed the game in terms of how archaeologists were looking at Scandinavia at that time, because it gave an indication of much more organization and strategy and kind of like military mindedness than just the idea of a bunch of random disorganized raids. You know what I mean? So it's definitely a very interesting little pocket in Scandinavian history, and considering it has to do with Harald Bluetooth, again, like I said, my favorite king of the Viking Age, given him and his father's rather distinctive rune stones, which later on when I make a YouTube video, I'm going to put right here. By the way, hey, if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, you should subscribe to my channel. You just scroll down a little bit and you hit the subscribe button. It's going to be very nifty. I think I've been making mostly more content, and I'm continuing to make more as we go. So if you like this sort of stuff, if you like hearing about archaeology and video games and all of that neat stuff, then yeah, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, please, because I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. Thank you. Yeah, guys, let's take a look at this, because what I want to do after we take a look at the articles and we get an idea of what the Trelleborg forts are looking like, I'm thinking we're going to do something that we haven't done on this channel in like almost 2 years. I think this was like one of the early things that I did on my stream, but I'm thinking about busting open Valheim and building a Trelleborg fort in Valheim. So I got to move quick so that we have time to do it. You were just going to ask me about Valheim? Brain reader over here. They had a big update recently. They had a pretty decent update, I think, that got pushed through within the past like month or so. So folks, Viking Trelleborg fortresses. These are as I said before, these were something that was used primarily by King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. And it was used mostly within the time period of around 970 to 980, just the late 10th century AD. Most of them are in Denmark, however. It is known that like at least one or two, I think, have been found in Sweden as well. So this is essentially what the fort looks like. It's a massive turf ring. It's got a depression around the outside that would make it difficult for difficult approaches, and then they would use the earth to mound up a ring around the interior, and then they would seal it off with palisade gateways. This combination of the dip trench with the raised wall with the palisade gates made for a rather hardy and secure fort. Of course, there were exterior structures, kind of support houses and things like that, and then the interior area would have 16, at the very least, 16 longhouses arranged in these kind of square designs. So a very cool concept, a very cool idea, very, very aesthetically pretty with the symmetry. I'm a big fan of aesthetic symmetry. Now, they are called Trelleborg fortresses because that is where the first one was found. It was in a place called Trelleborg. This is the Trelleborg fortress with one reconstruction of one of the longhouses that would have been featured here. They were able to date it to that time period by, I believe, tree ring dating. So they were able to date where in time these Trelleborg fortresses came from, largely because when they were excavating these longhouses, they would have the big support pillars that had tree ring data, like, you know, evidence. So you could count the rings on the trees, radiocarbon date, and between those two methods, you're able to kind of hone in roughly on a time period to within a pretty impressively small margin of error. It also helps that they were able to determine that Harold Bluetooth was the one in charge of this time period, and so that's how they ended up tacking their creation onto him specifically. The Trelleborg Fortress is one of the best known and important Viking-era sites near Copenhagen in Denmark. It's true, the Trelleborg sites are a big thing in Denmark, not only just as a tourist attraction, but as just a really informative piece of Viking Age history. They act almost as like a small kind of like village site, you know, because the idea was that all of the soldiers and the raiders and everything would come here, and then they had their families with them. It was big enough that they could support the entire army. It was like a military base, you know. Also, they do point out here, do not confuse Trelleborg in Denmark with Trelleborgen in Trelleborg, southern Sweden, which is a little bit different. A lot of Viking Age sites have been turned into these open air museums, like kind of reconstructions, historical reenactments and stuff like that, which is something that I absolutely admire and love, because that sort of practical archaeology, like the recreation of that time period and being done in using contemporary methodologies, but shown off in today's world, I think are just a really informative way of looking at stuff. There are a number of fortresses that were found. Harold Bluetooth constructed these around 980 AD to protect and strengthen his realm. A fifth ring fortress recently discovered near Køge. So they have five confirmed, and I think that there are maybe parts of others or reconstructions of others. I've heard between 5 and 7. These ring fortresses, despite being so prominent and so like probably decent at what they did, they weren't actively used for all that long. As short as 10 to 15 years in some cases. We don't really see it happening once it continues into the year 1000. Probably with the end of the reign of King Harold, they kind of stopped using these. And that might be because kings after Harold were not as... Like, Harold's whole big thing was he was like, I united Denmark and Norway, and I created one unified country. You know, here's my military. He was very big about showing that stuff off. You know, he was very audible about his conversion. He said, I united Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. That's what it says on his runestone. I think that maybe after that time, it was a little bit more of a return to form of like, well, there might have still been a single king who ruled over either Denmark, Norway, or both, but, you know, a lot more kind of tribal jarldoms were in charge again. So I think that the need for such a big fort, for such an active military compound, kind of faded after that time period. The threat of rebellion was removed. So there obviously seemed to be some sort of time period going on there where people were thinking, oh, you know what, it's a little rough right now. Harold felt like he needed to enforce his reign, enforce his rule. And so using these ring forts was a way to kind of keep his military mobilized and ready to go. The dissolution of the Trelleborg was peaceful, although the fortress itself was attacked violently at least once. So there was some kind of siege that happened at the Trelleborg fort, which probably showed off how decent it was. The existence of the Trelleborg Fortress was known for centuries, but it was only excavated during the 1930s, largely to prevent a motorcycling club from turning it into a motocross track. See, obviously you're going to see something like this on the horizon. This is a very distinct landmark on the horizon, and landscape archaeology in general is like kind of the idea that you will that you'll look at the landscape around, and you'll look at the way that the land sits and landforms happen to kind of determine how archaeology might be present there, or you might look at how people would interact with the environment around them. You love that. Now this is a thing also, and I've talked about this a couple times recently, like archaeology and stuff like this, it doesn't happen unless it needs to, you know? The Trelleborg Fort was doing just fine on its own. All of the archaeology was preserved in there. We had no reason to go and bother it until humans decided that they wanted to go motorcycling all over it. So that's when they went in and they started to do the excavations, and they started to actually uncover all of these things to try and, you know, preserve and save as much data as we could, because it was gearing up to be destroyed. This is something that I run into a lot with archaeology. A lot of the work that I do, a lot of the active archaeology work, particularly in the United States, is done specifically in response to proposed construction projects which would otherwise disturb that archaeology. And we don't really conduct a full-scale excavation like a phase 2 or a phase 3 unless we know that the project is going to destroy the stuff that's there anyway. We might go out and survey and get an idea and say, hey, there are these sites here. If you want to avoid them, then we don't need to do anything else. We just kind of leave them be. So we just want to keep it nice and safe. That's what it is. It's preservation. Now, like I said, a lot of these turf walls, these kind of raised walls had palisades and things that were used to help support it. It says here they had oak coverings on them on the outer side, palisades and walkways along the top to turn it into a kind of like earthen tree fortress, right? So these Trelleborg forts were kind of like the closest things they had to like a Viking castle. And some of them, I think they actually call them a castle. The inner fortress had 16 longhouses, as I said before, kind of 4 by 4 squares of 4. And I think this shows up on a couple of the other ones as well. It was kind of like a definitive design choice of them. All of the longhouses were uniform. Makes sense if you're going to have a, if you're going to have a square, you're going to want to have it all be pretty much the same thing. The reconstructed longhouse that's there now uses the correct floor plan, but it is probably a little bit taller than it would have been during the Viking era. That's good to know, especially because we're going to be going in and trying to rebuild this in Valheim in a little bit. Definitely a very cool element of the Viking Age. And here you can see another image of one of these Trelleborg forts with the cross streets that kind of lead to the 4 entryways and the outlines of the 16 buildings. Again, here they're talking about how in around 974, the Danish king Harald Bluetooth lost control of the Danevirke and parts of southern Jutland to the Saxons. The entire complex of fortifications, bridges, and roads, which were built around 980, are presumed by some to be Harald's work and part of a larger defense system. You can see where in Denmark these fortresses are, right? And they kind of run along a main thoroughway here. And then, of course, like parts of Sweden here as well. So it seems you can see the outline of like where this was meant to kind of defend against any kinds of encroachments that were coming up from the south, or from the west as needed. Is there any evidence that they dug into the ground a bit for the floor, or did they just build right on the ground? You talking about with the houses, with long houses? So, as I said, there are between 5 and 7 of these Viking ring forts, Trelleborg forts. Now, again, Trelleborg is one of those things that's it's kind of like calling tissues Kleenex. It's like it's an example. It's a brand. It's not it's not the official name. But ring fort is the more accurate term for what they are in general, because obviously it is a fort built in the shape of a ring. They have found similar structures in other parts of Europe. Europe points out particularly in Ireland, but none of them have the same strict and precise geometric design of the Scandinavian ring fortresses. And it is true, they are pretty high and tight. They have a pretty regular shape to them. Both the ring is exceptionally circular and pretty well measured. The crossroads come in at perfect 90-degree angles, and then they have the 4 structured longhouses that are all built to the same specifications. It creates an extremely geometric design. Now, as I said, there are about 5 to 7 examples here. One they list as Agersborg, the largest of the ring forts in Denmark, near Agersund. Dates from around 980 CE, again, right around the time period that we're talking about. And you can see where most of this one is left, is kind of put in. Obviously, they have been putting some contemporary stuff in the area. Bummer, but what can you do? Agersborg itself might have housed as many as 5,000 men in a total of 48 longhouses. That is a massive fort. Next, we have Borgring. Here they listed as Borgring, but it is Borgring, I believe. And this is located on Zealand, which is an area southwest of Copenhagen in Denmark. This one here probably also constructed around 970 to 980, again during Harald Bluetooth's reign. This one has been reworked over a lot more. You can see that's a much more modernized outline of the ring. That one, they've done a lot of work to help kind of highlight the shape there, particularly for visitors. Borgeby Castle. You guys are probably going to notice that Borg is in this a whole lot. Like, we have Trelleborg, we have Borgeby Castle, we have this place here, which is called Borgring. Borgring, funnily enough, literally translates to just a ring fort. Borg is the word fort. So if you're ever seeing a Viking place name with the name Borg, it means that it was at one point a fort. So Agersborg would have been the fort, like the fort that belonged to Ager. Ager's fort. Borgeby Castle. B is also a Viking place name suffix. You see a lot of towns, particularly in the UK, that end in B. Any place that ends with a BY means like town or place. It's like, oh yeah, the town of the fort town. Fort Town Castle. So this one here sits in Scania in southern Sweden. And again, dates to the reign of... There is then Fyrkat. Fyrkat here, again, pretty well defined. Northern Jutland. And also containing the same 16 houses, separated into quarters by the crossroads at the 90-degree angles. Trelleborg Slagelse. And this is the one that we were talking about at the beginning, the indicative typing of these ring forts, the Trelleborg. And then the Nona Bakken. This one here is pretty much completely covered over within the town of Odense in Denmark. This town completely built up around this ring fort. And this one is the only one that it sounds like is not attributed to Harald Bluetooth, and instead belonged to Svein Forkbeard. But it would have happened right at the tail end of Harald's reign, with 980 being the around the time that he stopped ruling, or 980s, 990s or something. Trelleborg in here being the last one. This one is in Sweden, and this one is a partially reconstructed ring fort built from turf with a wooden palisade. All of those there seem to be the examples of Viking ring forts that we have. These types of sites are listed with UNESCO, the World Heritage Organization, who is responsible for making a whole bunch of very, very fancy and cool lists of places of cultural importance that deserve protection and respect. UNESCO is a great organization. They do a lot of really cool stuff. Unfortunately, the United States pulled out of UNESCO in recent years, which means that certain places such as Cahokia Mounds in southern Illinois do not receive any more UNESCO sponsorship or funding or anything to help keep their sites and stuff going, because UNESCO does provide funding to help preserve sites and preserve archaeology in different places. And they recognize the Viking Age ring fortresses of Denmark as a cultural phenomenon worthy of protection. And here they list 5 specifically with their coordinates. S tier Cahokia Mounds. I actually was debating saying A tier Cahokia Mounds, but I didn't know if you were still listening. I was going to say like, oh yeah, A tier site Cahokia Mounds. So the UNESCO site lists Viking Age ring fortresses as having a uniform and stringently symmetrical pattern or architecture, characterized by an exactly circular rampart, concentric ditches, and gates at the 4 points of the compass. The gates establish the internal division of each fortress into 4 quadrants. The terrain chosen did not meet the demands of the geometric plan. Great infillings were made. The building's materials were grass, turf, timber, earth, and in some cases, stone. Fortresses were not entirely identical, some differed in size, largest of being Eggersborg, with an internal diameter of 240 meters. Trelleborg's inner diameter was 136 meters, so over 100 meters smaller. And then Fyrkat is 120 meters, half of Eggersborg. Trelleborg had an outer ward of 15 houses, while other ones might have had smaller groups or less amounts. And cemeteries have also been found next to the forts at Trelleborg and Fyrkat. So they did have, they did have burials and funerary practices that happened within these forts as well. Possibly as a result of conflict, or just as a result of, people passing in the wear and tear of being in the military. Here's an idea of what we might have looked at from the exterior. So behind these palisades and within this kind of inner portion here, this is where the turf would have been. And then they built these wooden palisades around the outside to help support them and fortify them against attackers. And these ramparts up here could have been walked along, and you can see they have the barriers here for archers to dip behind, very similar to what a lot of castles in Europe have. Harald Bluetooth was in contact with a lot of mainland European leaders. He became Christian largely because of conversations and things that he had with Christian leaders in other parts of the world. He would have gone to visit these places, he would have seen the things that they were doing, and he brought that back with him, potentially. I don't want to make any assumptions about Harald's mindset and motivations, but he might have seen some examples of similar types of castles within other parts of medieval Europe, and brought those concepts back to try and implement in his home country in their own way, to a certain measure of success. The archaeology of these areas has been rather fun to look at, and a lot of very awesome archaeology is happening there. We've got Søren Sindbæk and Nanaholm. Apologies for the pronunciations again. Why would they build these ring-shaped fortresses? Because it's the perfect shape for a fortress. It gives you a 360-degree vision on all sides, so you can see people coming from any direction. And it helps make things easier to defend and easier to secure. You're not going to get surrounded. Well, you can get surrounded pretty easily, but you can also defend on all of those sides pretty easily as well. And as we said, these were pulled from other parts of Europe. They might have learned it in England. They might have learned, you know, we said that they examples of them show up in Ireland as well. So lots of cool stuff there. What have you learned about these fortresses? The biggest surprise is that unlike the other fortresses that were abandoned after about 2 decades, one of them appears to have been used more than a generation after that. And we found a silver bracelet that is quite closely associated with silver rings, pendants, and other adornments that have been found at the other fortresses, so we can begin to link them all together. We also found the fortress had been attacked, and 2 of the large gates were burned pretty severely. We found a fantastic carpenter's toolbox that had been left behind when it burned, with woodworking plane, a nail iron for producing iron nails, awls, chisels, and a fragment of something called a back knife, which is just another kind of plane, a little of everything. Amazing finds coming out of here. Any photos of the silver bracelet? I do not see any, but we could try and look. Let's see what fort this was specifically. A 5th ring fortress in Borgring. Oh, here we go, here we go. The Viking toolkit. This is a good example, maybe. Here we go. Here's the Viking toolkit discovered at the Borgring. As we said, it was damaged during a fire, so it is going to be a little bit wonky, but here you can see where they've started to highlight out some different elements of it. Smartly, it seems that they excavated the entire thing with the dirt around it, and then they decided to do some CT scanning to check the artifacts within the dirt. This is a very smart detail. Particularly with like iron tools and stuff like that, you're going to have a lot of degradation, especially with acidic soils, which is something that you see a lot in Scandinavia. The soils in Scandinavia are not the best for preservation. And so what people will sometimes do, in order to keep the artifacts more intact, they will use less conventional methods of looking at what's inside the dirt. In this case, they excavated the entire dirt around and created a CT scan of what they're looking at. I've seen this method used also on Viking hordes, where they might get like a ceramic vessel that's filled with dirt and artifacts in it, and rather than trying to pull the thing apart and get at everything inside, it's easier and safer for them to CT scan the vessel with everything inside of it and try and see that way what's in it. But after they were able to do the CT scan, it looks like they did end up excavating the tools to a certain point. This is also a great idea for giving you the context of like, oh, how are they organized? How did they keep their things in the toolbox and stuff, right? And that is potentially a reconstruction. Yeah, it is. That's a reconstruction of what this toolbox might have looked like, which is very fun. Obviously a very important find. Tools are pretty rare. Objects that were made of iron were very rarely discarded. They were often recycled. Finally, animal bone evidence excavated at Trelleborg specifically examined evidence for pre-Christian religious rituals in 3 wells at the site, adding to what we know went on there. 2 children, both approximately 4 years old, and several animals appear to have been deposited in the wells on the site in an apparent pagan sacrifice to the gods. Very unfortunate. Really bummer to hear about the kids. It's what happened during that time period. It was not the best time. Yeah, so it shows that these areas, which, as I said earlier, it was a period of conversion. Gorm the Old, Harold's father, was a pagan. Harold was a Christian. So when he came into the area and he began the process of converting everybody, it was not a overnight one and done type deal. People were still participating in pagan rituals and pagan worship and pagan sacrifice, obviously, while Harold was actively trying to convert everybody to Christianity. This is one of the examples of top-down conversion, whereby the ruling class converts the people beneath them, as opposed to bottom-up conversion, whereby the lower class adopts the religion because it's the, you know, it's the religion of the people or whatever, and they start to use it, and then slowly the leadership kind of adopts the religion to keep up with their subjects. So Trelleborg itself shows a lot of very interesting examples of these things, and it's an area that I would, ring forts are something that I would love to dive more into, which is kind of partly why I'm doing this today. But yeah, so that's a pretty good cover of what we're looking at historically for what these ring forts mean. And that's, I think, a pretty good summary of what we can expect. Now, what I would like to do, if possible, is to see if we can get pretty close to reconstructing one of these Viking Age forts. Okay. So we're going to go back into our guide, Bjorn the Builder. No grinding for mats. Bye. You don't want to watch me cut down trees for 3 hours? Okay, cool. So what we're going to do now is basically showcase these two images. Good. So that's what we're trying to build right below me. This, I think, is a pretty good little spot here. What do you guys think? It's not going to be a perfect circle because I am not a perfect circle man. The main element of this build today is going to be mostly around the fact that we are kind of doing some landscape adjustments and taking advantage of Valheim's ability to have you do that, rather than working more on the construction side of things. Although we will be building something in the form of the longhouses later on. Good. Get these rocks out of the way. Trying to level this out a little bit more across the entire thing. So it is going to be hard to try and get all of this to sit a little bit more flat and even. Okay, starting to look pretty good. It's still a little high up here. But that's fine. We'll be able to whittle that down as we go. When constructing the floor plan of this ring fort, the things that we're going to want to keep in mind are, number one, we're going to want the sunken-in trench around the exterior. This is not a perfect circle, but we will do what we can. Obviously, we have picked up a lot of height right at the tail end here. So I will probably have to come back around this way particularly. I think is going to need a lot of choppa. Actually, let's see if the leveling will just... Yeah, it will. And it is going to be a little bit weird to have a sunken trench that's kind of going around the outside of something that is itself sunken, but that's the tragedy of the environment. Once we get this whole thing lined up here, this probably is not going to be scale. I mean, we could clear it out and try and actually make it to size. I just don't know how you would measure. That might be an interesting thing that I guarantee people have done online. Is like, if I find out what the real life equivalent width of some of the construction objects is, like if we know, oh, one of the Valheim floors is exactly like 1 meter, right? Then we can build a actual size accurate model. I don't think we'll have time to do that today. And maybe doing a size accurate model of the longhouse would be a really great project for us to come back to another time. If we can get the outline of this ring fort put in, like a scale model of the ring fort, and then we can put a life-size version of a longhouse another time, that would be a lot of fun. So far, what I think needs to happen is a little bit more rounding on this side here. Kind of meet up with that. I am God. The game uses meters as measurement. 1 by 1 floor is a 1 by 1 meter. Okay. The walls are 2 meter wide and either 2 meter or 4 meter tall. That's what Reddit says. So yeah, if we're going to be trying to do this, that means that we need 120 to recreate the smallest of the ring forts. We would need 120 floors wide, interior diameter. So it will be actually a little bit wider around the outside, which is massive. So I could measure it out and we could see where we're at and see how much further we need to go, because it probably wouldn't be terribly difficult to just do that. What have I told you, people? Half scale? Half scale is not a bad option. Might be the best way to do it with the time frame that we have right now. Mainly this little corner up here is where, I mean, this is where it starts to get higher up there, because the near perfect circle element is going to be the most difficult to do. And that's just sheerly from the standpoint of, like, it's hard to make a perfect circle. We'll get there, or we'll get somewhere close. Once we have this all flattened out, then we'll pull out some foundations and we'll start doing some measurements to see where we currently stand at our widest diameter. it'll also be a chance for us to see how many meters we have to go. Because it will be tough. And I don't think we're going to be able to get a 100% perfect circle. Not unless we spend a whole lot of time doing it. Which, I don't have a whole lot of time today to do it. Which is why I wouldn't be opposed to coming back to this on Thursday. If we wanted to do that. To try and really get it done right. Could be a lot of fun. Especially if it ends up like looking really gorgeous. Do that archaeogaming. Yeah, we gotta make it happen. It's the point of the channel. We played a lot of Pokemon. We played like 2 weeks of Pokemon. We gotta rein it back in with the more educational content. If we can get that, then we'll be in good shape. Get it? Because we're trying to shape the ground. Okay, now let's take a look. Not a perfect circle, but honestly, this part right here is pretty good. I think that what I need to do is I need to continue that circle around there. So that portion over here, this is the part that needs to get the leveling off now. I would like you to craft. No, I'm sorry, I would like to build. And what I would like to build are foundations. I don't want to do stone. Well, I do want to do stone floor. Did it say 2x2s? 2x2s. Okay, so these are 2x2 meters. So if we are going to make the smallest one of the Trelleborg fortresses, the smallest of the Trelleborg fortresses was 120 meters in diameter interior. I just noticed how much I'm lagging. I don't care if these are even. I just need them to be matched up width-wise. And then let's see what our final width ends up being with these. 52, 4, 6, 8, 62, 4, 6, 8, 72. We are at 72. 60 meters is a half scale. Let's see, what was the diameter of Trelleborg itself? So that diameter right there is 90 meters, which is half scale, which is insane. Like, think about how big that fort is. It's like the entire, like this entire little compound right here is basically the diameter, and it would be a perfect circle around that. That's a massive structure. Probably want to get the full crossroads going right now. So if that's 90, that means we'll have to come to 45 to do the crossroads. So right here is where the width crossroad would have to happen. That should be, yeah, that looks like an even, that is an even cross there. If I can get the circle leveled out with that crossroad in there today, I will be happy. I think we're gonna have to cut down this tree. Whoops, ouch. Trying to get that height is tough. We might be locked by the constraints of the game from getting it 100% flat, but there's only so much that you can do. That was definitely not fully rounded right there, I know. I mean, actually, that doesn't look that bad. Jesus. Did I just get struck by lightning? It's actually funny, the fog here is actually helping me because it's showing me like the depth that I need the ground to be at to be even with everything else. So this actually works out pretty well. No, the picture's not showing anymore. There it is. Hello there, child. He wants to build too, I don't blame him. Okay. Okay. How's it going? Hi. Hi, Tom. Hi. How are you doing? Whoa. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. You know the routine. Hi. Well, buddy, we're playing a Viking game today. And we're making a big circular ring fort. Called a Trelleborg Fort. Can you say Trelleborg Fort? Oh, bless you. Thank you for sneezing on my hand. The presence of human child might mean that we do have to pick this up on Thursday, which is fine because we were going to try and do that anyway. Hold on, bud. Say it into the microphone. What are you saying?
Next time.
See you next time.
See you next time.
Yeah. Yeah, you've learned the ways. You've learned the ways how to YouTube it.